Okay, screws are out. We got 9 screws in this thing here. You got one here. You've got one here, one here, one here, and the 2 long ones here at the back. And also, right here, you've got 2 inside the throat of the carburetor, but these look different. These are the flat ones. These got round heads, as you can see. So the flat ones, the 2 flat ones go in here, right down there and there. And make sure you don't confuse and mix them up. And don't forget to put them back in when you're done. So we got this thing broke loose. So normally you would take this out. Like I told you with the drift pin thing, you get that in there. But since this is just a parts carburetor for now, I'm just not going to worry. I'm just going to hang it over the side here. So let me set you down here and we'll get this thing brought out. And lay it over. Alright, one more second here. Let me do a little maneuverating here. Alright, now this is what you can be looking at and once you get inside here. Now if you got one of the later style Quadrajets, don't be traumatized. They're basically the same. This first thing you'll see here, this is your accelerator pump diaphragm. Got a spring on it. This is the cup right there. There's got a little spring in there that holds it out, just like a little neoprene cup of a thing. And when they get old, especially if they haven't been used in a while, they get hard as a rock. So if you got any off-idle hesitation issues, like I said, this thing may be getting stiff and you may not get a very good pump shot. And one thing to remember is it's got a spring under it that pops it back up, so be sure if you ever have this thing out that you put that spring back in there. And one other thing, there's a little steel ball bearing that goes in the very bottom of that. Makes it in like a one-way valve. It means it can push gas. It can suck gas in from the float chamber down here, but when it tries to push it back, it closes that ball bearing off and it makes the gas squirt out here and not back where it came from. Hope that makes sense. And here is your power piston. Right here. This carburetor is very old and crusty and dirty, but I'm going to go ahead and pull the gasket off here so I can show you something. Well, I see something already that could cause a problem. If you look here, see if we can look in here. You see that power piston there? You see how it's popped out of its bore? Normally that thing is supposed to be down in there. It's got like a little, right there, that thing on the top, right there by my thumbnail, that little nylon, is supposed to be down in here. That thing's supposed to sit all the way down, but those things, when they get old, they'll tend to pop out. So if you got one of these things that seems like it's just running pig rich all the time and you can't get it straightened out, you need to look in here and see if that thing might have popped out. Because if it pops out, it pulls the metering rods, which are these things here. It pulls them out of position. I'm going to go ahead and pull that up so you can see it, if it'll come up. It's kind of seized up in there, but that may be a pain here. Let's see what we can do. There it comes. Yeah, that's your power piston. Tell you briefly what a power piston does. That's actually, I told you about the 4th circuit. You got an enrichment circuit. What this thing does is this power piston here sits down in this bore, and it's also got a spring there that tends to pop it up, but it sits down in this bore. And what happens is, you see it's got the metering rods on it, and you see how these metering rods, even as dirty as they are, they narrow down. Well, think about it. When this piston, if this piston comes up under spring pressure, it enriches it. That they sit in these jets in there, right? You see the jets are, well, you can't see them, but they are in there. These things sit in these jets, right? And just imagine that when this piston's down, this metering rod is way down in there, so it's a thicker part is down in the jet, so it lets less fuel flow through. Alright, well this thing, vacuum acts on the bottom of this power piston whenever your vacuum signal is pretty high, so it keeps them down in there like they should be. You know, if you're just easing around with your foot barely on the gas, you know, you don't need any enrichment. So what happens is when you gas that thing, when you punch it down, the vacuum goes away. So what happens, this thing has got a spring on the bottom of it, the vacuum signal goes away, so it goes boop, it pops up. See, what happens when it pops up is it gets to the narrow part of these metering rods and it lets a lot more fuel flow through the main circuit. So that's how those work. That's what a power piston is right here. And like I said, there's that retainer right there, and that thing, those things, when they get old and brittle, they're notorious for screwing up and popping up. So you need to check that, make sure that it's not done that. And if you're rebuilding one of these, when you put this back in, what I normally do is putting this gasket around here. Sometimes people don't put them around the right way and it hangs the power piston up, so you need to be careful about that. But if you put this, when you put this thing back together, when you're frigging around with it trying to get this gasket fixed and everything, it can kind of pop that out. So what I do is, I know I'm saying a lot and I hope you're following me, but I get that thing put in place and I'll take a screwdriver and I'll just carefully stake some of this metal over to hold that thing in. And I've never had another one come out. So that's one thing to check. That can cause a definite, very rich running situation. And there's a spring. So this is your blocker plate for your float. It's just a cover of sorts. Kind of takes up some volume. It's not really a good idea, but it's got to be there, I guess. Now, here's the float system. This is a very important thing on a Quadrajet or any carburetor. See how this works. It's got a pivot pin that holds it in. This is the float itself. It's just a nylon float. Fuel resistant. Looks like this one's been replaced at some point. It's probably been rebuilt years ago. But look in here and I'll show you how these floats work. You see that? I can't really get a good angle, but this thing sits on this pivot here, and the float is this part that is right, let's see, right at the tip of that screwdriver. You see that part right there in the center of the tip of my screw? That's the float. It's got a nylon little rubber end on it, which I'll show you. And when the fuel level in the float bowl raises up, starts filling up, this float is held down, of course, so it can't pop up. So it acts, this end where my finger is, starts pushing the end of this float, this needle valve down, and it seals against the inlet. So it's supposed to cut the fuel flow off. So you see about how far it comes up? So that's how the float on a Quadrajet works. Most carburetors work on the same principle. They just have different ways of doing it, but they usually always have a float that directly acts on a needle valve and seat. So let's take this thing out. It just pops right out. The hanger's gone off this one. Normally, there's supposed to be a little wire hanger that connects between the end of this and that needle valve, but it's missing in there somewhere. There's the jets right there. You can't see them very well, but those, see there, that's a jet. So let's just go ahead. I'll take my finger and pull this needle valve out so you can see it closer. There it is. That's the needle valve. And see, there's the little neoprene end on it. Now, if these things get dried out, they don't seal that good. See, it's just got a seal against the metal right there, so it doesn't have a lot of force on it. So if this thing gets any dirt in it, if you're not running a good filter or you're running a carburetor without an air cleaner on it, which is a really bad idea, you can get dirt in here. And especially if you've got like a rusty fuel tank, if it doesn't clog your fuel filter up, if it gets, any of that gets past your fuel filter, it will just wreak havoc with your carburetor. You will never be able to keep it from flooding. So this is your seat right here, and this thing just screws in. It's got a slot right here. You can use a larger than this screwdriver just to turn this thing out. It's got like a little gasket under it. So whenever you rebuild one of these, make sure you put the gasket back on there, and it gives you a new needle and seat. And it just drops in. But like I said though, this float's missing something. It's supposed to have that little hanger that hangs this thing on the bottom, kind of like that. But it'll work without it. It doesn't absolutely have to have it, but I think it just drops in there. The very oldest Quadrajets had a different kind of needle and seat arrangement, but you probably won't ever see one of those anymore. And this is just the float. This is a very common type of float. And you see this thing's got a cutout there in the arm of it. These things are easy. You just bend the float to adjust the float height on these. But you need to, first of all, you need to know what the float height is, and they're different from every kind of carburetor, every kind of Quadrajet. So don't ask me to tell you which one where you should put it at, because you need to look up the model number of your carburetor over there and get the specs for it. But that's a good kind of, you see where it's at, right? It's kind of almost level with the top of the float chamber. But the thing about this is you take a little, they give you a little ruler of a thing when you get a rebuild kit, and that's how you measure it. You measure it from the toe of it, which is about where my finger is, up to here. So it may be like a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch, but it's all, they're all different. So you got to get the specs on it. You can't just go with what I'm showing you here, or just guessing at it. But I'll tell you this much: if you ever have one of these Quadrajets that it runs good most of the time, but whenever you come to a stop, it's like it's about to quit. It sits there and it starts to lug like it's flooding out every time you put the brakes on pretty good. And then it kind of, after a couple seconds it straightens out. But if you're behind the vehicle, you probably see it put out some black smoke, and it's running rich just for a little bit like that every time you stop. Well, I've had that experience, and what it is usually your float's set too low. Well, I take that back. Your float's set too high, because what happens is your float's adjusted too high, which means this thing is too far up towards the top of the carburetor when he's got that thing closed. The gas tries to run up towards the front of the carburetor because you're putting the brakes on it. Lets that thing come down a little bit, and it lets even more fuel come in the float bowl, and then it starts getting sucked into the venturi here, and that's what makes it run rich for a split second. But if it's running rich all the time though, like I said, you got some other things you need to check in here first. But if you got a carburetor that's this old and you don't know if it's ever been rebuilt, you definitely, best thing you probably do for it is rebuild it. And I'm not going to explain how to tune one of these Quadrajets. There's different ways to tune these, but that's one thing the Holley people, they hate about these carburetors, is they're not that tunable as far as like just changing jets. Holley has just jets or a metering block and all, well, jets, metering block and all that stuff, and you can just tune the hell out of it. But Quadrajets are kind of, what Rochester did, GM did, is they kind of, at the factory, they kind of calibrated them for a specific engine, like a 305 or a 350 or a 400 or a 455 like that. So the calibration for a Quadrajet for a 455 is not going to be ideal for a 305 engine. It'll run, but it'll probably run a little bit rich. You see what I'm saying? So we're just not going to get into that. Let's just suffice to say, if you've got a 305, you need to try to have a 305 carburetor on it. Just check the numbers and find out which one you have. And if you can load, there's plenty of these Quadrajets still floating around. I mean, bukus of them. So you can just jump on eBay and get a good used one and rebuild it if you need to. Likewise, you don't need to try to run a 305 Quadrajet on a 455 Pontiac or something like that. You just, unless you want to do major surgery with these air bleeds and that type of stuff here, you don't even go there. It's just you just find you a 455 carb and put on it. So see, we got some dead insects here. There's looks like a dirt dauber that got in there and couldn't get out. That's what plugged the holes up, I guess. But Guys, I think that's going to wrap it up for this little diagnostic section. I've covered everything I can think of, and I've showed you the culprits that can be causing the different problems. Now, I've done videos about the secondaries, the debogger Quadrajet series. I've done those videos. I've done the choke. So if you're having problems with that type of stuff, please go back and watch those videos, because it'll probably tell you everything you need to know, and maybe some stuff you didn't want to know. So please go back and watch those at your convenience. And if this video has not answered the problem, or the other videos don't answer your questions, please feel free to ask me questions. I'll try to get back to you just as soon as I can on it. I'm glad to do it. Now, I noticed something when I took this thing apart. I told you in the debog your Quadrajet videos about these secondary pickup tubes here. These are your main here, but these are air bleeds actually, but these are your pickup tubes for your secondary. You notice there's only 3 tubes here. I told you they can fall out. Well, sure enough, here's one in action. See, I just took the top off this Quadrajet. Never had the part before. There's the tube laying down in there. And what happens is, if you got one of those tubes falling out, that means only one side of these secondaries, this side that's got the tube out of it, it ain't working no more. It's just sucking air, it ain't sucking fuel. Because these things, you know, I told you in that video that these things suck air and fuel. They've got these discharge ports up here that throw fuel down in there, so they got to be in there. The tube's got to be in there. So this carburetor probably had a pretty good bog in it when you hit the 4-barrel. If both of them fall out, that thing, it will not run on the secondaries. It just won't do it. It'll just die every time you try to stomp it. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if there's anything else you want me to cover, just ask me and I'll be glad to do it. So until next time, happy carbureting. See ya.